Hello, welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray, CPA, and my guest today is Richard Lambie. Richard is a professional fiduciary. He's licensed in California, and I've known Richard for quite a long time. He has quite a history in the trust area. At one time, I remember you were working at Bank of the West for a number of years.
Yes.
And then how long have you had your own business now as a professional fiduciary?
As an individual, as a private professional, I've been had my own practice for 19 years now. So.
Oh my gosh, doesn't the time go? Geez, it's unbelievable. So it's sort of a fledgling profession, and so we want to talk about what is the role of a professional fiduciary today to help some of our viewers to become a little familiar with a service area that they may know very little about, but may be very important for your family. And so that's why I've asked Richard to be with me here today. So, okay, Richard, there are all kinds of people that have these revocable living trusts and other things, and they may not have any idea of what's going to happen down the road when these mature, if you will, these plans mature. So why would someone choose a professional fiduciary or a trust company instead of a family member or a friend as a conservator, trustee, or an executor?
Right. Well, Mike, thanks very much for inviting me to contribute to this segment here for you. So great privilege to work with you in the past on our projects. And yes, the things that we're talking about today involve wills and trusts and powers of attorney. And as you correctly state, the lawyers will do a whole raft of documents. Very often they're in a 3-ring binder, and the individuals, their main mission is to get away from the attorney, go back home and get on with the rest of their life. So they really don't look too closely at what's going on. But some of the key components in those documents will be who are named as the beneficiaries. And generally, if we're talking about a husband and wife situation, you'll have the husband and wife as beneficiaries as long as they live. And then it will translate back down to children or charities or other relatives and that type of thing. And one of the key components within the documents, whether it's a will or a trust, will be who's going to manage that estate. Mm-hmm. And so it really doesn't matter what type of document it is, you need a manager to do that. And the very good estate planning attorneys will spend some time with their clients considering the qualifications of who's going to be a trustee, whether it be a child, whether it be a bank, or in my case, whether a professional fiduciary would be appropriate. So the factors that come into play are, is there any family? Because very often it is the family members who are appointed, either a child or children, could be a friend or a neighbor. And what we've developed, as we were saying, in the last 19 years that I've been a professional fiduciary, and to some period before there, is that one of the options is to nominate in the documents a professional fiduciary. So the reason that you do that, as I say, is that there may be no immediate family member available. It may be inappropriate to have a bank involved, that there may be very few assets. There may be very challenging situations involved with family members with different characteristics. So to have a professional fiduciary really is the core of the plan that you build in the management. One of the benefits of having a professional fiduciary is generally they have enough experience dealing with different people's assets so that they won't get terribly excited if one person says one thing, another person says something else. So they're a little bit more, how should I say, durable than the family member or the friend that's stepping in. So what I've seen over the years is very often it's the parents that are the glue that holds the family together. Yes. And when they're no longer there, sometimes the old arguments come into play, and it's very difficult. So again, having a neutral can solve that problem by having it outsourced to somebody that's familiar, not just dealing with the assets, but also dealing with the emotions behind the family and being able to work around that.
Yeah, as I said before, the referee is gone.
Yes. Yes. We've had a few situations where neighbors could step in, very good friends. And neighbors are absolutely fantastic. I've got an example right now in the local area here in Santa Clara County where the neighbor has known the gentleman for almost 50 years and very, very loyal. He does not want to deal with the estate. This gentleman never married, never had any children, and the neighbor has said, where is somebody else? It's just not going to be me. So that's where it's very good to have the ability to call in a professional fiduciary to step into that role.
Yeah. So I think I'll put this in a nutshell. This is really a big job, and we're going to maybe talk a little bit more in some detail, but managing assets for somebody, in some cases arranging for the care of that person and so forth, it's a really huge responsibility to give to somebody. And some people may be offended. On the other hand, they may be relieved when they find out that you either they can say no, which sometimes we sort of coach them to do, or you just don't really list them to be the fiduciary, the executor or the trustee. So anyway, so you guys fill a very important role, I think. And yes, in many cases, though, people don't have any other family members or other people to step in, and so to have somebody who will be responsible to take on the job, is a huge service.
Yes, and it allows the family members, if there are some, to be family members and not the trustees and the financial controller, if you like, of the family business.
Right. Okay. So we're sort of talking around this. If you've been named as a trustee or an executor, and you don't have experience, in other words, you're that family member, you're that neighbor or friend, and you don't have particular education in this area, what are some things to think about before accepting that position?
Yes, well, to make comments on that, you really have to look at what a professional fiduciary would do and then work backwards from there. So one of the things that we do is that we do an assessment of the situation. And part of the assessment are the characters that are involved. If we're taking over with the elder still in place, very often we're dealing with care for the elder as well as just care for the assets. So it's exactly what an individual should do. What are the components of the case? If there is care for the elder that's required, they may be in a senior housing situation, which is relatively easy to maintain and manage, or they may be living in their own home. And if they're living in their own home, it will be absolutely critical to make sure that all of the services are provided for that. So really what you're doing is building a network. But before you even start, you've got either generally the care for the elder, and you've got to look at the resources that are available. So before you sign on the dotted line to sign the acceptance, you've really got to go through, make sure there are sufficient assets, maybe get a hold of a tax return, talk to the elder if they're still available, go through the assets to make sure that there are enough funds to do their job. Mm-hmm. And then also a document review is very, very important. A lot of people at this point are afraid of attorneys, and particularly in the area that we are in Santa Clara County, the values of the real estate, even if the person has a home and nothing else, they should really, really, really get professional help from an attorney. They should make sure there are no tax traps they're getting into with a good qualified CPA such as yourself. Talk to the investment advisor if there are any investments involved. If there are real rental properties, talk to a property manager, and really do a whole assessment of the case before they step, as it were, over the edge.
Okay. So
really team building is part of what they're trying to do to see if they even want to get into the job. But it's very important that they have caution doing that, because they may be a professional engineer, they may be a medical professional, but what we have is a whole different language set. Mm-hmm. So when you get into the trust and estates and the administration, we have a whole different language that we speak.
And also, I guess we could say a different set of skills to some degree. Another thing I think you sort of talked about at the beginning when you talked about the characters, so I'll talk about that for a moment, and that is, I think looking at the people, in the family and so forth, and trying to assess the relationships and so forth, do you really want to step into what could be a cat fight or something like that? So here's something that you may have had good relations with at least some of the people in this family for some time, and suddenly you're the one that's going to have to play, to some degree, the mediator or whatever, and again, this is a really difficult role, and so I would think very carefully about before accepting that.
True.
What standards does a professional fiduciary have to meet in California in order to be licensed? So how many trusts do you need to manage before you're subject to these requirements?
So I'll take those in reverse order. So the number is 3.
Okay.
So what I refer to as 3 is that if you are an individual and you're managing 3 trusts for non-family members, then you're required to be licensed at that point for 3 or more. So then you should go out and look at the Department of Consumer Affairs website to see what the parameters are for, as it were, getting under control and becoming properly licensed. So the standards that the professional fiduciary has to meet when they're going through a qualification process are really fairly rigorous. There are education, testing, background, fingerprinting, and a whole slew of things like that. Again, more specifically described on the Department of Consumer Affairs website. One of the issues behind all of that is with regard to the family members that may cross over. So there are exemption areas. So a family member, so if you were trustee for your parents' trust, that's an exemption. If you're trustee for your brother's trust or your grandparents' trust, that doesn't count. So the family members have an exemption on that. Mm-hmm. Attorneys also have an exemption, just a blanket exemption. They can be a trustee, absolutely no questions asked. Mm-hmm. There is a more limited exemption for CPAs within the scope of their practice, and an even more restrictive exemption for enrolled agents. So there are some limited exceptions to that. Mm-hmm. So the Department of Consumer Affairs keeps a handle on that. They do have some enforcement provisions, but quite honestly, as with any state government, they do rely on people reporting to them if there's unlicensed activity going on. Mm-hmm. So with the education requirements, generally it's best to have a bachelor's degree of some description. It's not specific as to what the subject should be. You're required to have 30 hours of education within fiduciary subjects. So this would be on the investment side, on the legal side, on the conservatorship side. So building a list of 30 hours of education. Then there are the background checks, the fingerprinting checks, and then after all of those have been completed, then the individual is able to take their test as a fiduciary. So that's again a test that's administered, and it's got a relatively simplistic pass rate, but again it's a minimum core standard. Anybody who's looking at a professional fiduciary who does have a license should always do their own due diligence. Where does this person come from? What's their experience? What's their background?
Okay. So then, when might the family want to have a bank or trust company as a conservator, trustee, or executor? So, and what's the difference between a professional fiduciary and a bank or trust company?
Okay, what we're going to do here is go back to the origin of this whole thing is where the people creating the trust or the will or the power of attorney are advising their client. Mm-hmm. So the discussion that they should have is what's appropriate to manage this particular estate. Mm-hmm. And one of the core issues that I would bring up here, the difference between a professional fiduciary and a bank, would be size. And in this particular case, size does matter.
Yes. And
for very large estates, and I was involved peripherally with an estate with assets in excess of $100 million, it was more appropriate to have a bank with the controls and the oversight that a bank has rather than having a professional fiduciary involved. Mm-hmm. So in those respects, it's very important. One of the other factors would be the longevity of the trust. How long is this trust going to last? Because if the trust is going to be in existence to do what I would call a probate administration, collect assets, distribute them out, then really if the fiduciary is in their 50s or something like that, they can do it. There's not a longevity issue. If it's a trust for a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old for their lifetime, you potentially got a 20, 30, 40-year trust. Again, more important to have a bank involved because they have the longevity dealing with that beneficiary, the assets, the administration over a long period of time, which may be very difficult to do for a professional fiduciary. The banks have another tremendous advantage, whether it's a trust company that's organized under the banking regulators within the state or the FDIC. They have a lot of audit capability, or actually a requirement within there, with the federal auditors, the state auditors, their internal banking auditors. So there are a good amount of checks and balances within the bank itself. Pluses and minuses, some people really like having an individual. They could quite possibly name a chain of professional fiduciaries, or give the fiduciary the ability to name a successor fiduciary, somebody who's obviously licensed, has a certain amount of experience. So you could get a chain of fiduciaries to fulfill the same role, because if a fiduciary gets hit by a truck, they're no longer signing anything. If a trust officer at a bank gets hit by a truck, it's very unfortunate, of course, but there is another trust officer at the bank that can step in to sign the checks. So you do have that longevity with a bank trust company that you do not have with an individual fiduciary.
Right. So a lot of assets, dynasty trust, probably a bank or a trust company. And then, but, maybe grandma and grandpa, and this thing is going to be settled out to family members within a few years. It sounds more like the professional fiduciary might be a better fit.
Yes, yeah. And that's not always true. I had a trust that I've administered since 1997. So that's going back a few years.
Yeah.
So that's almost my entire career as a professional fiduciary, where the elder just lived a very good, long life. And when we came up to the point where the elder finally passed away, at that point we had some appreciated real estate to sell, and our very good wise CPA said, well, Richard, you really should keep a tax reserve for 4 years. Because of
might be audited or whatever.
Yeah, so get through the audit period. So that's been quite a long-lived trust, and the beneficiaries are very concerned that they've got to wait another 4 years for their final distribution. We're not keeping the whole trust, of course. So I have dealt with some trusts over quite a number of years.
Yeah. Okay. What are the key documents that a professional fiduciary implements?
Okay, going back to the infamous attorney binder. So within this binder, I was going to say mythical binder, but it's a very real binder.
Yeah.
So within the binder there can be, or most often nowadays, there's a living trust. So the majority of what we see is some form of living trust. So that's involving activities as a trustee, where the individual who created the trust, or the couple that created the trust, act as their own trustees as long as they're able. So you take over as some form of successor trustee. And the important fact in that may be it could be a voluntary, as in the fiduciary is named in the document, or involuntary, because if a fight develops between the family member trustee and the other family members, quite often, or in a number of cases, I've been appointed by the court to sort out the family squabble. So, mom and dad have chosen a child or a couple of the children, but they've not been able to do the job. So again, under the trust document. And so the trust document describes all of the duties in terms of collecting the assets. And as you're familiar with your work, a single living trust can have sub-trusts under it. And I think one of the cases we've dealt with over a few years, the grandmother's trust is divided into 3 sub-trusts. And some of them are for the lifetime of the individuals. So there's the main living trust and then the sub-trust created under that. We have very few cases that involve a will. A few people are, I should say, smart enough to realize that they don't have to set up a living trust, fund a living trust. They can just die with the assets in their own name, leave a will. It goes through a probate process through the courts, but it's truly not that onerous. And if they're not leaving the money to family members, the statutory probate fees are not a big issue in their book. So I've dealt with a couple of probate type administrations over the last few years, but really very, very few in terms of the total number of my cases. Powers of attorney, again, going back to the mythical binder, the powers of attorney are very important, and particularly as the administration by professional fiduciaries of conservatorships in different parts of the state of California are really very, very difficult. There's a lot of court control. The court's very worried about what's happening with assets under a conservatorship. Power of attorney is a very, very powerful document, and it would allow somebody like a professional fiduciary to control assets, as long as they're in the name of the individual, to manage those assets, pay the bills, deal with bank accounts, brokerage accounts, and real estate in a lot of cases under a power of attorney document rather than a trust. So power of attorney is very, very powerful. Power of attorney for finances is what I was just referring to, but also power of attorney for healthcare. And the associated document, power of attorney for healthcare, would be, power of attorney for finances would be for healthcare. So healthcare decisions can be made under that type of document, which is drawn up by the attorney. It's not involving the court. There's no court appointment of a conservator. You're an agent under a power of attorney. So very, very important documents. Some fiduciaries will act as an agent under an agency agreement. And what you can have there is, if you do have a family member who says, by golly, so-and-so named me as trustee, I'm going to do the job, but I need help. That was the wise part of it. They know they need help. They can bring in a professional fiduciary to act as their agent to help them with the bank accounts, the brokerage accounts, packaging information for the tax returns, and generally as a compliance person to assist with the administration. So an agency agreement, I quite often act as an agent, not under a power of attorney, but an agency agreement, sort of like a contract between the family member trustee and myself. So quite a range of documents.
Yeah. How can a professional fiduciary help an individual with failing health or the family of that individual?
Keyword there is resources. Most of the fiduciaries that you will speak to who've been in the business quite a number of years will have a network of professionals. Some of our fiduciaries are very, very good in terms of visiting with the elder, coordinating doctor's appointments, and getting involved directly with the healthcare of the individual. Other fiduciaries will operate on a model where they bring in a professional care agency to provide the care for the elder in their own home. They would have a care manager who's going to coordinate medication management, doctor's visits by the elder, coordinate any hospital visits should the elder be hospitalized. So really creating a bubble around the elder of protection. So they have good qualified people. They have caregivers, for example, who would be properly regulated, screened, have background checks, and have regular payroll run for them, rather than people who are hired for cash by the family members. So, really a very, very good protection level around them. I've been involved in a few cases personally where the elder has been frail when I got involved in the case and has got progressively more and more ill. Very, very important, if it's a family member or if it's a professional fiduciary, to look at the wishes of the elder. And again, this is where the emotion can be very difficult. With a family member, a fiduciary is more likely, not 100% guaranteed, more likely to look at the documents, look at the wishes of the individual as to how they wish to live out the final days of their lives. So in some cases, the elder may request in their documents and their actions full care, full code, absolutely everything to be done medically. Other people will say, just keep me comfortable. So that's really a critical area that the fiduciary can either assist with family members or be the decision maker themselves. So very, very big area on that.
Yeah. It's almost like you're adopting a family member here in a way. I mean, somebody who's going to look after you and take care of your finances and so on. I just view this as such an important and helpful service all the way around. But some people, of course, are reasonably concerned. We only have about 3 minutes left, so I'll let you know that. So what is the oversight for professional fiduciaries?
Okay, a number of oversights, and I'll speak as fast but as clearly as I can. The document that appoints the fiduciary is the controlling document, whether it's a will or a trust, conservatorship documents through the court, and the regulation comes in by control by the court if necessary, and also by the ethics that are imposed on fiduciaries by the Department of Consumer Affairs. So that's really it in a nutshell, but nothing, Mike, can ever exceed the inbuilt ethics of the professional fiduciary, and that's absolutely key as to when the family members are interviewing a fiduciary, really, really look at that, make sure the fiduciary is on the same wavelength with them.
Yeah. So when you're interviewing somebody to be a professional fiduciary, again, this is going to be a key person for your family. That's going to be managing the finances, sort of doling out the money, and so forth. And you and I know that there's some negotiation that goes on in family meetings and other things. related to this, and so it's really important to find a person that you can work with, but also that it is trustworthy. When we say trust, you really do need to trust this trustee, and so then we have seen some cases where sad things have happened or what have you, but people have misappropriated, and families are really severely hurt. And so, again, just be aware and think about requiring those accountings and so forth. You don't necessarily want to waive those accountings and so on. In fact, I think most professional fiduciaries would sort of insist on them.
Yes,
Okay.
that's true.
Yeah. Well, Richard, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and sharing
You're very welcome.
some information about your very important profession. I think, folks, that you may find yourself, that you or a friend may be in a position where you need one of these very important people. And Richard, was there a directory? Is PFAC website or
PFO, pfac-pro.org, or the Department of Consumer Affairs both has lists of fiduciaries by county within the state of California.
Okay. Folks, we'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.